Hi everyone, and welcome to the Just About Managing podcast with Chris Dingle, John Lloyd, myself, and our special guest this week is Vince Sanderson.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me.
Excellent, great to have you on board, Vince. Great to have you on here. We'll ask Vince to introduce himself in a minute to you all, so you get a bit of his background. But just to sort of feed you into how we found Vince, if you like, and how Vince came onto the podcast, is that the young-minded member of our Eagles, who is an avid TikToker, followed Vince on TikTok and told us about him, and he thought it looks fantastic. It's a great video, so we'll let Vince talk about that in a second as well. But what we thought we'd bring Vince on to talk about here is subject for today is around difficult conversations. I think we've talked a lot in the past about psychological safety, about teamwork, about team dynamics in there. But one of the questions that often pops up, and we've talked about a lot here and in our world, in our work worlds, if you like, in the past, is the challenge that people have with difficult conversations. It seems to be the common theme that pops up there. So that would be a great opportunity to talk that through with Vince on here. But just to kick us off then, Vince, would you be okay to give us a bit of a background on yourself and a bit of a bio and talk through where you've come from, where you are now and what's happening?
Yeah, of course. So my name's Vince. I'm I was about to say I'm a manager and management coach, but as of last Friday, I'm no longer a manager other than a manager of myself for the time being, although that will hopefully change in the coming year as well. But I was a manager for the past 10 years in an organization. We specialized in mediation, so a lot of work with organizations and companies that were struggling to manage situations internally, and then often had to ask us to go in to manage situations, try and prevent it going down a more punitive, disciplinary type process. So done that for the past 10 years, managed a team myself for 8 of those 10 years. So a big focus for me was on things like difficult conversations, managing through difficult times, getting people motivated, resolving relationship issues or conflict that comes up. So usually it's the stuff that managers tend to steer away from. They don't find comfortable. They find difficult to have themselves. And the stuff that people never get training on, you're often thrown in at the deep end. So I started posting on social media a couple of years ago. One of my friends challenged me to do it because they said, "You like talking about this stuff, don't you? Why don't you make some stuff on it for other people to watch?" So that's what I've done. I'm posted now most days, every day, every other day, around that cadence for, I think officially it's coming up to 2 years. Actually, maybe it was yesterday, 2 years yesterday, I think it was. Fantastic. August the 18th was when I posted my first TikTok video. I didn't want to do it, if I'm being honest, certainly on TikTok, because that's for young people that like dancing, was what everyone is told. But of course, it's not that. There's all sorts of things on there for professionals. And things have gone really well to the point that I'm able to do this as a full-time job as of last Friday, and now go out and continue to go out and work with organizations around training their mainly middle managers, the people that often get forgotten, around how to manage people more effectively, create more effective teams. We always talk around leadership, and all managers are great leaders, but the focus is normally on the people at the very top of the organization, and the people in the middle get squashed between these competing priorities. So that's my focus.
And that is funny, because when I, through my TikTok research, came across you and your TikToks, ironically, was exactly that same premise, which was I was delivering some management training and I was looking for some pre-watching, and that was in some ways we've kind of blatantly ripped off your "Hi Vince, I'm a management coach" in the Just About Managing, because I think one of our realizations was exactly that, which is there's gazillions of articles and people talking out there about leadership.
Yeah.
But I think we are very much this firm belief of that foundational element of management actually is so important in terms of the lifeblood of the organization, but equally in terms of making you into an amazing leader as well if you don't have that element.
Yeah.
So it's, that's for all of us, we're quite passionate about that element.
Absolutely.
As well.
And you often hear on social media and talking around in society as well that they're almost pitted against each other. You're either a leader or a manager, and it suggests that they're two polar opposite things, and therefore leadership is great and managers very bad. But it couldn't be further from the truth in that all managers, good ones anyway, are going to be great leaders. They're leading their team, they're motivating, they're inspiring, they're giving direction to the team. And so we shouldn't really separate the two. It's leadership and management as one thing. And I know obviously senior leaders have a slightly different role, but all managers are great leaders, or they should be anyway.
But even the senior leaders still having to manage people, aren't they?
Exactly. Yes.
And I think often that's kind of, you lose sight of that. People lose sight of that element. So in organisations I've worked in as well, the irony is that there's this myth and misperception that the more senior you get, the less you got to manage people. But actually, the irony is the senior people that aren't managed or mismanaged create even bigger problems in an organisation than the junior people. So,
absolutely.
Yes, harsh lessons learned around that.
And I think that unfortunately adds into people becoming managers and maybe senior leaders who don't necessarily have the right training for it or currently the right skill set, because they think, as I move up, I'll have to do less of that stuff. I'll pass it to other people to do. And unfortunately, it's the very opposite, in that your path upwards requires you to have more people management skills, more emotional intelligence, have more difficult conversations on a daily basis. And I think that's where the rub often happens for people who are individual contributors, because they're expecting something more from managers and senior leaders. But if they've gone into it for the wrong reasons, then it creates tension.
Yeah.
So Vince, what got you into having lots of skill in difficult conversations? You kind of walking around the playground looking for trouble and then kind of sorting it out? Or
it's funny.
What led you to this?
It's funny you should say walking around the playground. I don't know whether you know, Chris, but I used to be a teacher. So yes, literally walking around the playground looking for trouble. Not me personally,
okay.
But so I was
conker season now too, as well, right? So be even if you're allowed conkers these days. So sorry, go for it. So what led you to this teaching?
Yes, so I was a secondary school science teacher at the start of my career. Kind of fell into it as maybe some teachers do. I had every intention of becoming a dentist of all things, and didn't get a grade in my A-levels, so went and did more generic science degree, biomedical studies, with the intention of following it through into dentistry. Didn't enjoy university that much, and thought, do you know what, I do enjoy younger people, talking to them, teaching them, let's inspire the next generation, all of that great stuff. And if I'm being honest, didn't enjoy teaching that much. I enjoyed the teaching element. I enjoyed being in the classroom. I enjoyed working with students. What I didn't enjoy was all the work in the evenings, the prep, the planning, the marking, the dealing with families sometimes that might have a different hope for their child in school, of those types of things. But so I decided to leave teaching, but still wanted to work with young people. So went and worked in a youth offending service. And interestingly, a lot of the young people that I was teaching at the time and were excluded from school, I ended up working with. And part of that I did, this is a little bit of a convoluted story, I'm aware. I did a secondment working with an organisation called Victim Support. And my job was to mediate between young people who had committed their first offence and the victims of that crime. So whether it's shoplifting or continual antisocial behaviour in the area, things like that. So that was my first taste of mediation, and absolutely loved it, to the point that I then followed my career into mediation. So started working with a company, or was part of the team that set up the company, providing mediation around the UK and a couple of places internationally, but I never went out there. And then for the past 10 years, I've worked with all sorts of different organizations, from private companies through to the NHS, education, charities, third sector organizations, anywhere where relationships break down, essentially, and found that I loved working in the grey area where usually people are put off it. And certainly when it comes to emotions and people feeling frustrated and irritated by what someone else has done or said or not done, all of that stuff that normally everyone goes, no, don't want to deal with it. That's the bit that I'm like, yeah, let's get in there and let's have a bit of fun. Obviously, it's not fun for them doing it, but it's very rewarding, because it's what people are often put off by it. And there's one kind of feedback that we often get as a team was, thank you, you were the first person that actually just listened. And it seems so simple, and it's very easy to do in one sense, but I guess it's quite gratifying as the person doing it that, I was able to provide a safe space for someone to feel heard, understood, to vent, to get things off their chest. And I think certainly transferring that into management, it's such a simple skill to learn, but not necessarily easy to practice and develop. And I think one of the things that often puts a lot of people off, unintentionally or they're not aware of it, is, I think I mentioned this to John and Lee last time we spoke, is that because it's a skill that we've done for however long we've been around for, we think that we're naturally good at it. And there is a huge difference between our conversational listening style and the style of listening we need to have as a manager when things aren't going in the direction that we hope, when people are feeling unmotivated, when they're feeling challenged, when they're stressed, when they're in conflict with a colleague or a customer or a client, whoever it is. There's a really different set of skills needed, and one that not many managers are given the training on.
And that's the bit that I think you mentioned before as well, Vince, is, throughout my whole career, I'm not sure about yourself, John and Chris, but I can't ever remember having any training directly associated with conflict management or difficult conversations. It was sort of tips picked up from people around me, or that other people just tended to avoid them at times. And if you had them, you were seen as a standout because you started to have those conversations. It was it's such an obvious place where there is a miss, I think, there.
Yeah.
In organisations, but very few people seem to address it. So,
yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. Of all the organisations that I've worked with over the years, we're talking like hundreds and hundreds of organisations, very few have a robust management training path. They'll have leadership training, and they'll have clear paths with external organisations that they like sending their future leaders on. But very, very rarely do you find someone that goes, yes, I did a conflict resolution course as part of my management development, or I did a difficult conversations coaching course, anything like that. It just really doesn't exist.
No. What would you, for people listening to this at the moment, Vince, that are in those management or leadership positions and aren't feeling that confidence about difficult conversations or starting the ball rolling, what sort of tips would you give them at a very high level in there, do you think?
Yeah. I'll start off by saying that the main thing that puts people off having difficult conversations is usually one of three things, or a combination of these three things, which is, first and foremost, they're not sure what to say because they've never been taught anything. I mean, yes, I know there are lots of models out there, SBI and Fuel and Oscar and all of these models, and they're great, but they don't necessarily give you the details that you're after of, yeah, but what do I say in this moment? What do I say in response when they don't respond in the way that I hope. So we're not sure what to say. And lots of people, just as a little side note, lots of people don't get this even as they're growing up. I think you're actually really blessed if you grow up in a household that teaches quite overtly and consciously emotional intelligence skills, but most people are not aware of them. And if it happens by proxy. So you enter the workplace having had 18, 21 plus years of not being taught how to have meaningful and difficult conversations. That's why they're difficult, is just really how we feel about it, because we're panicked about what to say. The second reason is we then have no chance to practice it because we avoid it like the plague often. And then the third reason that we often call them difficult conversations is because even when we know what to say and we've had a chance to practice it, there's no guarantee how the other person's going to react. And most people jump to a worst case scenario. Oh, I've dealt with something like this before. I've seen how they behave. They're going to take it awfully, and and they over catastrophize it in their head, and then they overcomplicate their preparation for it or lack of preparation for it, and it just seems such a bigger conversation than it needs to be. And who says it? I think it's Kim Scott in Radical Candor gives an analogy along the lines of, would you panic around saying, John, you've got a piece of food in your teeth? Probably not. Would you panic around Lee, or your zip needs, your fly needs zipping up? Probably not. But it's no different. You go into it with the same candor. And if we don't panic about ourselves too much, and we do practice and get our words right and have a little think around it, even to the point of making sure that our intention is really clear at the start of the conversation, as much as we can't control how the other person will react, we can influence it. And we influence it by being practiced and really clearly thinking through what we want to say and why we want to say it, and setting the tone and the space right for that conversation.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Guys, you've got a dumb silence from all of us. It's a great thing. I actually had to deal with a difficult conversation at work very recently, and even just listening to you and reflecting on that, and one of my reflections in terms of how that conversation went was actually how my younger self would have dealt with it completely differently to how that conversation actually played its way through. But you're right. I totally get your context around that. Okay, how prepared are you? But also, how prepared are you to actually go and have that hard conversation in the first place? And where's it going to where's that path going to take you? It can be difficult, but my listening to that first bit, and being obviously the hundreds of conversations that you have had, difficult conversations, and particularly being that I guess facilitator of those situations, or in that mediation role. How much do you think of it is our Britishness that actually causes some of that versus? Because I imagine you must have worked with other nationalities.
Yeah.
Do you see that as a trait, or is it more
absolutely.
human nature?
Yes, I would say culturally it is different, but culture is upbringing, and so it really the defining characteristic in how it plays out is usually the people that raised us, rather than necessarily where we grew up in the world. Obviously, there is a connection and a correlation there. But it was certainly one of the things that I would say cognitively, I knew it was going to happen, that different people would enter into mediation and communication differently. However, when you're in the moment and you see it playing out, there is an element of panic that can set in, because when we're not trained, we always bring in our own way of doing things, and we'll call it common sense because everyone loves a bit of common sense, but there's no such thing. So what I expected to work and how people would communicate is simply how I was raised. And then when people communicate differently and their expectations are different, and someone might come across really abruptly, and to them they're being clear, and to someone else they're being rude. Those types of cultural differences, or I'll just say family differences, because really it's that, are the bit that I think certainly a significant part of what panics managers. When people react in the way that they wouldn't react themselves, which leads into one of the hardest things in these situations is remaining non-judgmental. And it's loads of people will go, well, yeah, of course. But there's a huge difference between saying it out loud and genuinely not judging people for the way in which they communicate or the way in which they come across in a difficult conversation. I actually think that takes quite a bit of practice to train your brain, unless you're naturally that way inclined, to train your brain to be non-reactive to body language, to tone, to facial expressions, to the way people breathe. If John says something and I don't like it and I go, people pick up on it, and they may not go, oh, it was the way you breathed, but internally they then react to it. And that can happen for you as a manager, or in my case as a mediator often, that not only have I not got to react, I've got to now manage how the other person is likely to react without coming across like I'm taking sides. And I think that these are the types of subtleties that, again, they make these difficult conversations. That's what really makes it difficult, and this is why models only get you so far, is they don't talk about that kind of stuff. So we go in, all right, I'm going to use SBI. Brilliant. What's the situation? And someone goes, what do you mean, what's the situation? Oh, hang on. You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to answer nicely because I've asked you nicely. This is what stresses people out, I think, and what we're not trained on.
No, completely.
Yeah, that whole conscious, unconscious learning, right, Vince? Like when you're starting driving a car or something, you've really got to be aware of what you're doing, and it can feel difficult in that first moment. I was just wondering, you were talking about, difficult conversations, people getting angry and that kind of stuff. But like in the corporate world, there's a massive issue in terms of like trying to communicate as a two-way thing because of like hierarchy bias.
Yeah.
So, with all the best intentions as the manager, you could be trying to start this conversation with somebody, but you're paid more. They're worried that it could lead to like repercussions, or I can't really, is it really a safe, you're creating a psychologically safe space, come and talk to me, that kind of stuff. Have you got any thoughts around, how you do create safety for people?
Yeah.
And, that kind of encouragement, how do you do it? Because you could create this in theory, this great thing, lay out all the right space, walk around the park, do whatever you're doing, change state. But yeah, any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think, do you know what? It's a really good question, Chris. Positional power is something that we often, something that managers and leaders will often misunderstand because they themselves don't want it to be an issue, and therefore don't acknowledge that it is fundamentally an issue, whether you think it is or isn't. And so one of the, I guess I'll sum it up as a quote, and apologies to whoever said it, I don't know. Someone might be able to Google it. And it's words to the effect of, you can't talk your way out of something that you spent years behaving your way into. Now, in this case, we can swap you for management. Managers can't talk their way out of something that previous management behave their way into. So what we have to acknowledge in positional power is that there's a few different elements here. Number one, people have had bad experiences, probably, of managers in the past. So it doesn't make any difference to them when we say things like, oh, well, it's different here. I've got an open door policy. Come to me whenever you've got a problem. I'm not saying don't say those things, but realize that they don't really make any difference to someone that's been burnt in the past. The only thing that makes a difference is that we act differently. In fact, I will go as far as to say is saying it out loud might almost dilute it. Just be different. Be someone that is integral. Be someone that's trustworthy. Be someone that's honest. At the end of a one-to-one, when you say, yeah, I'll do that for you, and then by the next one-to-one you've not done it, why are they going to believe you on more meaningful things if we can't do it around small things? So that's the first thing. The second thing is that, again, from childhood, a lot of the time, if you're aware of transactional analysis, I'm going to kind of butcher it a little bit here, is that we easily fall into a parent-child relationship because of that power dynamic. Even if we intend not to, if the other person wants to revert to a childlike response, and you hear people say things like this, well, that's above my pay grade. It's not my job to deal with it. That's your job to deal with the other person. And to change that is a cultural challenge, not just one single manager challenge. And I think one of the hardest things about becoming or developing as an effective manager is recognizing that it's very hard to do it in silo, in a bubble. You can only get so far. So if the four of us are managers and John is the only one that's really making an effort for his team, yes, they do appreciate it. Yes, they will benefit from that, and John should continue. But they will also look at myself, Lee, and you, Chris, and go, well, they don't do it. And it influences how they see John as well, because he is grouped in with the rest of the managers. And so to answer your question, kind of pull the answer back around, is it's not just the job of a single manager to address this. It's the job of the organization to say, all right, what are we going to do about the perception of management in general? What are we doing as a company to show that we are honest, integral, authentic, trustworthy, empathic, all of these values that we want? How do we do that in our one-to-ones? How do we do it in our processes? How do we do it when things go wrong? How do we even have a system for having difficult conversations? Or do we just hope that the four of us wing it as we go along and it somehow turns out as an okay end result? Therein lies the problem that we mentioned at the start. Very few companies plan it out. They just hope that we are okay at it. And that's what causes a lot of the problems further down the line with people, and why positional power never really gets addressed properly, because we don't sit and talk about it and we don't address it.
Do you think, just extending that positional power and some of my reflection in terms of when I was, I guess, younger in my career versus more in the twilight of my career, how I felt about, yes, you always worked in an organizational hierarchy, but my confidence in myself in terms of, do I know my shit or not, versus actually my organizational awareness and comfort of navigation in terms of, my belief in myself, changed my complete attitude in terms of that hierarchy. Again, going back to the young John, you're almost a complete reverence of, and it goes back to your point of this parent-child relationship. And I think some of my own personal development and of awareness of myself and my capability and strengths most definitely changed my mindset around leadership and those above me, and how I was willing to challenge and interact. But I know that's unique to me. But do you see and perceive those elements?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're also seeing, and this is a big subject, and we'll tread carefully, is that's one of the changes generationally as well. one of the really good changes, I would argue, generationally, is that I'll speak for myself in that, or certainly my parents grew up in a generation where their parents were the ultimate authority. Unless you happen to go to the library and rent out a book because you couldn't access any knowledge, and therefore you grow up thinking the person senior to you is the ultimate authority. That was encouraged in schools. It's encouraged in certainly early workforce. And now we're seeing that that's not true. I have an 8-year-old son. If I say the sky's blue, he can Google that might not be true. And a lot of I think this is a good thing, though. A lot of the young people coming in are realizing that just because you're above me in seniority doesn't necessarily mean that you are right. Doesn't mean that I should just defer to you and listen. And so that comes with an element of confidence. It could be misplaced at times. There's no getting around that. But I think that it has a lot of benefits as well, that we avoid falling into the trap of the direction that we travel is always dictated by the person at the top, rather than they may have the final say, but it's a collective conversation. And I think coming back to what you were talking around, John, is that, I think we always still, as we get older, look back and go, I wish I could have changed this and I would have acted a little bit differently. But coming back to the sort of parent-child, I like seeing that a lot of the young people that I've worked with seem to have more adult conversations rather than falling back into a parent-child relationship. And I think that's brilliant for the workforce.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, the power of the team is in the team, not in
Yes.
the hierarchical positions, right? So getting that, opening up and including those views, creating value and equity in each of those positions, people being able to have those channels, that releases the power potentially of the diversity of the team, regardless of, the tenure or the age of anybody. So this is like a real challenge for people who are in those managerial positions who have maybe got old school thinking, maybe like north of them, or even in their head around particularly like work from the office and work from home, right? The world has proven that, you trust people, work from anywhere it can work, but, views that you need to be inside an office, for more days than not, without good justification and without a buy-in that is the right thing, creates disengaged, silent quitting, all this sort of stuff, right? It's just
Absolutely.
mad. So any let's I'll be old and like, no, you all must come into the office. How would you convince me, Vince, that I'm wrong? Like, how do we get people who's like stuck in that way, stuck in the mud? So I'm stuck in the mud now. Like, right? Oh, come on, everybody back in the office. This is what we need to do, and we're all so much better together. Even whatever. That's the rhetoric.
Yeah.
How do we convince that person to be to see the future?
Well, a couple of things. First thing is something that you said, Chris, reminded me of a quote. So I did some training with an organization called Twilio a couple of months ago in Canada, and they put up a quote around tenure, and it said, tenure isn't a measure of success, it's a measure of time. And I think it is really important that just because someone's been doing the job longer does not mean they're more qualified for a promotion, doesn't mean they've got more experience doing what we actually need someone to do, doesn't actually mean that they're even any better. There are lots of young people coming through that are much more switched on to certain things, and after a year, they may be better than someone after 20 years. Coming back to your question, how do we change someone's mindset that is stuck in their ways? I will give you an answer that I would apply to any situation, not just coming back to the office, which is, I'll say it as a quote, behind every action is positive intent for the person that's doing it. So in your case, Chris, as that character, what's your positive intent?
All get the team together, all be part of delivering for the clients. This will make us stronger, better.
Great. Does anyone on the podcast have a problem with those intentions? Probably not. We might have a problem with the mechanism to achieve that, which is where the discussion must revolve around. And there is the answer, really, is that we should always lean into these difficult conversations as a conversation. It's not a one-directional, this is my thought and you're having it and you'll do as I say. That's the fastest way to, it seems, switch younger generations off and hop to another job. I'm not being, spending 8, 9, 10 hours a day being talked at, told what to do when I've got my own mind. I want a conversation. I want an adult to adult conversation, not a parent to child telling off or talking up. So part of these difficult conversations are going into it with the right mindset, pragmatic optimism. Let's be realistic around what's achievable, what's not achievable. For that to be a discussion, we need to actually have some data, not just an emotional thought. Nothing wrong with emotions. They're wonderful. But if someone's saying we should all come back to the office for X, Y, and Z reasons, brilliant. Do we have any data that backs that up? Does output increase? Even if it's qualitative data, do people feel happier connecting? Does collaboration speed increase? Do people feel more connected when they're physically in the same space compared to online? Before we make these big decisions, let's actually do some data collection. And this is really important because when we enter into conversations like that, and it's something that we're willing to discuss, and I always attribute this to Steve Jobs, but I don't know whether it was him that said it. It's not my job to be right. It's our job to get it right. Here's my suggestion. I think we need to be back in the office, and I've got some data that backs that up. Here's X, Y, and Z data. What are your thoughts around that? Does anyone have any data to suggest the opposite? Because if we don't have any opposite data, we might just all put on our blinkers and go, oh, look, it looks great doing this way. So when we're making these big decisions around, and I think it genuinely is a big decision, should people be back in the office? Should it be hybrid? Should it be completely, what's the word I'm looking at? Remote.
Yeah.
Then we need to enter into a substantial conversation around it and get people's positive intentions to stay at home, positive intentions for hybrid, positive intentions for coming into the office. And why that's important is what we know is that when people feel heard and understood, they're more likely to accept a decision that they didn't think was the right decision because their opinion was validated, it was acknowledged, it was worked through. And at some point, a manager or leader has to make a decision, but people accept that if they feel heard. And that's the bit that I think a lot of companies have missed over the past few months to year as we've transitioned back to COVID. And this is based on some anecdotal evidence that I have, and then just a bit, reading in the news. Some of the larger organizations, it seems that it was dictated to rather than conversed. And I think that's what rubs people up the wrong way, is not the final decision. It's the feeling of not being included at all.
Yeah.
The other thing that person should do, me in character, that I should do is clearly, Vince, click on Vince on your TikTok and listen to more of this.
Yes.
He's showing how old he really is now. He doesn't even know how TikTok works, Vince.
Or it's TikTok or the Facebook, one of those two.
Yeah.
John, careful. We'll make you do a dance in a minute and play Candy Crush.
One thing I wanted to go back to, because it's fascinating listening to you, Vince, and thanks again for the insight in this. I think that was a brilliant point on the work from home. So that's such a a hot topic at the moment, particularly in the organisation we've left, I think, in there as well, particularly. One thing I just want to go back to is something you said right at the start when you started talking about the difficult conversations themselves. Is, we've talked about it a lot on the podcast in recent weeks, actually, about controlling the controllables. Particularly in that sporting world, and we've talked about it before. But then back in these bits, we can't control how somebody else is going to react. We can influence, to your point, but we can control how we go into that conversation itself.
Yeah.
And then you talked a little bit then about people avoid those conversations at times because of the catastrophizing the thought process. What's going to happen? How's this going to happen? Getting into their heads a little bit. And I think the other thing for me is then we often think, and it goes back to Amy Edmondson a little bit, there's that fear of failure.
Yeah.
And going, well, if I have this difficult conversation, what if I fail in quotes in this conversation? But is there a failure in those sort of conversations? What's your thoughts on that, Vince?
It's such a good question, and it comes up a lot in training around but what if it goes wrong? It's certainly something that I've panicked about over the years, and it's similar to the what we mentioned earlier around learning to drive. At the start, it's nerve-wracking. What if I crash? What if I mess up? What if I, do all of these things wrong? And X number of months, years later, you don't think about it. You don't get into your car and panic. Hopefully not panic around what could happen, because it's so distracting from you actually doing the job that you need to do. I would say this, there is no shortcut to that I know of. It comes with practice. And the amount that you can get in can speed it up, of course, but it really is just practice. Having said that, one of the things that I recognized after a few months of mediating a lot more was that it wasn't my job to know the answer. And this isn't true in every conversation as a manager. It is good to be a subject matter expert at times and to be able to offer guidance and support. But as we all know, the best method as such to these conversations, certainly as management, is the coaching style, which means that it's not our job to go in with a predetermined answer. It's our job to create a space where the other person works out an answer that is both right for them and right for business needs or whatever the other case may be. That's the mindset of difficult conversations as well. On the whole, again, there may be exceptions to it, that I go into any difficult conversations, whether it's around, I don't know, what's been some uncomfortable ones, bullying, allegations. One of the most painful ones was that someone smelt, and it was a strong smell, and it was causing problems in the team, but no one felt brave enough to have that conversation because it's a very personal conversation. If I'd have had that in the early years, I would have probably just turned it down. Not because there's anything different in the conversation, but because of my own emotions at the thought of having that conversation. That's all that changes, really. After having practiced it, but not that specific conversation. You don't need to practice that one conversation. You just need to practice difficult conversations in general. You realize that you really need to get out of your own head and get out of your own way, because a huge part of what makes it awkward and uncomfortable and difficult is you then. Is how you're reacting, how you're feeling in the situation, and you're making the conversation about you and your feelings around it. And it just doesn't need to be. It's about the situation. How can you support anything that needs to change? You want to explore it. You want to understand it. You want to understand their points of view. And really, in most difficult conversations, I actually don't have opinions to give, advice to give. My job is to create a space where someone feels, as I've mentioned, heard, understood, valued, acknowledged, recognized, and then we problem solve something. That's it. And we wouldn't panic if John was struggling with a formula in an Excel sheet. I wouldn't go into that conversation nervous because it's just a problem that we can solve. That's the mindset that I have around anything much more personal. It's just a problem and we'll solve it. Nothing more than that. It doesn't need to be personal. I don't need to make it difficult. I'm aware you might be uncomfortable. My job is not to make any judgments. It's simply to listen and to work out a way forward. That's it.
Fantastic.
Wow.
Is it getting, just to close off on that piece as well, then, is it getting comfortable then with the outcome not being what you thought it might be to an extent then as well?
Yeah. There are times when we have a specific outcome. We should be very clear about that up front. There's no point in trying to hide anything, gotchas, tricks you, or, I need to get you to the same outcome that I have. All of that makes people very suspicious of managers because we play games with people. We don't need to do that. If you've got an outcome that the company needs, state that up front. This is the outcome that we're after. We have to have a conversation. I'm hoping we can work towards this outcome. If that's not the case, then it's probably not up to me to suggest what the outcome is. I may have some barriers, some bumpers up. It can't be too much this way and it can't be too much that. Again, be open and transparent about it. But it really is a conversation. And the more psychological safety there is, the more trust there is built before these conversations. There's often where, again, it might seem obvious, but where people make mistakes is they wait for these difficult conversations to build trust. Oh, look, I'm cool. I'm relaxed. I'm laid back, aren't I? People don't believe it at that point. It's everything that you do around it that makes this conversation easier, because we have trust, because you know that I'm coming from a good place, because I've proven it time and time again, which of course as a new manager is difficult because you don't have the proof. But that should always be the focus in the first 6 to 12 months. Yes, I've obviously got to make some progress in projects, but my main priority is proving to my team that I am someone that will serve them and not just micromanage or absentee manage.
Brilliant. I think it's very similar to a quote we had from another guest a few weeks ago where he said, leadership is example.
Absolutely.
I think you're spot on. It's living it as well. So now it's brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Vince. That time has flown by as well. Any sort of final thoughts from John or Chris at all?
No, well, I was more going to actually just ask Vince for he's very good at his 4 things, or so actually I was more going to after Chris has spoken, I was going to ask him to do his 4-thing wrap up from our conversation, but that was probably it from me. But Chris,
That sounds brilliant. So Vince, fantastic. Thank you, brother. Brilliant.
Thank you.
Let's cut to the chase on what John just said. That sounds brilliant. Let's do that.
So what do you want me to answer?
Go on, John.
Your 4. Oh, that's 3, isn't it? Those who watch the video, I can't count the number of fingers on my hand.
So number 1 is practice maths. Number 2.
Yeah. Your 4 top tips for entering into that difficult conversation. That's pretty easy. Number 1, focus on your mindset first and foremost. Get out of your own head. It's not about you. You're there to create a conversation, serve the other person in finding a way forward. And the mindset we always want is pragmatic optimism. Let's be realistic, but always err on the side of hopeful rather than cynicism. The second one is absolutely practice your listening skills. And again, move out of your own way. And Vin Gyang has a quote, I might butcher it again, which is, don't hold on to who you are today so much so that you don't give your future self a chance. Wow.
And that is a brilliant quote. And it massively is important for managers around things like listening skills. Okay. We can always better. Even the best listener in the world, whoever that may be, will be the first person to say, I can be better at this. The third one, be really mindful, and you'll need to record yourself or have people give you feedback of how you do come across when you listen and have these conversations. So, for example, I pinch my forehead a lot as I concentrate, which is not an issue when I'm on my own. But if John's telling me something difficult, it looks like I'm being judgmental. If he says, I'm really anxious about what's happened, and I frown at you, it looks like I'm thinking something that I may not be. And then the fourth one is actually do use some structure to the conversation to begin with. And once you get comfortable with that, keep using the same one that you find useful. I would always encourage any organization to have one that they use across the whole organization. So there's consistency in A, for people practicing it, B, for people on the receiving end, that they know what they're going to get. And number 3, it's the same whichever manager they go to. They will get met with the same consistent, tried and tested method, rather than the quality of the conversation is completely dependent on which person you go to. That's not a good idea. So mindset, listening skills, can't remember what the third one was, and then a model for consistency.
Get out your own way, I think it was, wasn't it? The third one.
Yes, how you come across.
Yeah.
Record yourself.
Record yourself, that was it.
Yes.
So, yeah. Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Vince.
You're very welcome.
I think what just to sort of close off at the end, I think what's brilliant is when you talk about management and leadership, and John, when he asked us about this podcast, was very much to think about management, because leadership gets a lot of the focus. There is obviously that gap there. People want to hear about it, want to learn about it. And, I think one thing you didn't say at the beginning, obviously, Vince, is from a modesty perspective, you have 170,000 followers now on TikTok that are obviously listening to this advice and need this advice and want it. For our listeners here, how do they best listen to you, follow you, connect with you?
Yeah, social media is the main way. So TikTok is where I spend most of my time currently. YouTube will be growing much more over the coming year if you prefer long form content. Written content on medium.com if you prefer that. And then my website is just being redone. So it's about to go live this week. So you'll be able to find me at vincentsanderson.com. Nice and easy to remember. So if anyone wants to work with me, whether that's management training programs, creating them, one-to-one coaching, conferences, keynote speaking, mediation. If you're not sure how to do it, whether that's you need someone like myself to come in and offer some support, or whether that's training your managers to mediate more effectively, that's often a very popular topic that people want support with. So lots of different ways to get in contact with me.
Brilliant. And what do they search for on TikTok and YouTube to find you, Vince?
Vince Sanderson or Vincent Sanderson. And I use the same picture on all of them, so you'll know it's me. As always, just be mindful if you do follow me, there are bots out there. I will never reach out to you. I will always wait for you. So if someone's saying, contact me here, it's not me.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Vince. And I'm sure I speak for John and Chris when saying that was fantastic. I'm sure we'd love to have you back as another guest eagle again in a future episode as well. You may need to lose a bit of hair before you come back next time and fit in with the three of us, but we'll make exception for you on that one.
Amazing.
Thank you very much. For those of you listening, hope you've enjoyed that as much as we have. Please continue to follow us on the various platforms across Amazon, Apple, Spotify and LinkedIn. He's been Chris Dingle. He's been John Lloyd. He's been our guest eagle, Vince Sanderson. I've been Lee Smith, and you've been listening to Just About Managing.